I've known about meditation since high school, and in all the years since, I've had a complicated relationship with it. Not a distant one. I understand what it is. I've read about it, I've tried it. I genuinely believe in what it offers. And yet somehow it never became a regular practice, which puzzled me for a long time, because on paper, I'm exactly the kind of person who should meditate. The mind-body connection, metaphysics, Zen, the inner life, these are territories I'm drawn to naturally and consistently. So why wouldn't the practice take root? When I finally sat with that question, honestly, the answer was almost embarrassingly simple. I love to think. I mean that in the most literal sense. My mind wants to move down every corridor of thought, into every half-open door of mystery, following ideas wherever they lead without a destination in mind. The river of thought in me doesn't want to be dammed. It wants to run. And when I looked at what traditional meditation was asking of me, to slow the current, to clear the banks, to sit in the quiet and watch the water rather than write it, I kept hitting the same resistance. Because I actually like the way my mind works. I like the wondering. And that felt like a contradiction I couldn't resolve, until I stopped trying to resolve it and started working with it instead. What I arrived at, over time, is something I decided to name for myself. I call it Meditattra. It has roots in meditation, the stillness, the closed eyes, the deliberate turning inward. But the rules are different. There's no breath work to anchor me. There's no instruction to observe thoughts and let them pass like clouds. Instead, I lie down or sit upright, close my eyes, and simply release the mind. Let it go wherever it wants. Down the halls of wonder, through the territories it's been circling, into the questions it keeps returning to. I don't steer it, I follow it. And what I found, what keeps surprising me, is that this wandering isn't chaos. It has its own intelligence. In those free-flowing sessions, I find my way to visions for the future I hadn't consciously formulated yet. I process things my waking, task-oriented mind doesn't have room for. I hear the quieter signals from the subconscious that get drowned out by the noise of ordinary days. For me, the river of thought is the practice, not the thing to be tamed, but the vehicle itself. I think there's something worth saying about the broader principle here. The human mind is extraordinarily varied between individuals. What produces clarity for one person produces restlessness in another. What grounds one person destabilizes the next. And there's a kind of quiet violence in insisting that everyone arrive at inner stillness through the same door. The traditional framework of meditation is genuinely valuable. I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying it's one architecture among many possible ones, and that the architecture has to fit the mind that's living inside it. If a practice keeps failing you, it might not be a failure of discipline. It might be a mismatch of form. And the answer isn't to push harder against the mismatch. It's to look honestly at what actually works for the specific, particular, unrepeatable mind you happen to have. Meditattra works for me because it doesn't ask me to become less myself in order to access stillness. It finds the stillness that's native to the way I already am. That, I think, is what any good practice should do. Meet you where you are, and then take you somewhere deeper from there.
Some minds are lakes, still, deep, reflecting everything that passes above them with perfect clarity. And then there are river minds, always moving, always generating, always finding the next bend before the current one has finished. I have a river mind. I've known this for a long time, and somewhere along the way I stopped treating it as a problem and started treating it as what it actually is, a fundamental feature of how I'm built. The river mind thinks prolifically. One idea suggests another, which opens into a third, which has 4 implications, each of which branches outward into its own territory. It doesn't wait for permission to explore. It doesn't pause at the edge of a familiar thought and decide that's far enough. It keeps moving, because moving is what it does, and somewhere in that movement, things get made. Connections form that linear thinking would never arrive at. Questions surface that more orderly minds might never think to ask. The river doesn't just carry water. It carves the landscape it moves through. But rivers also flood. And this is the honest part, the part worth sitting with rather than glossing over in favor of the more flattering description. A mind that won't slow down has its own friction. There are conversations where the river is moving faster than the moment calls for. There are nights when the current keeps running long after rest would be the wiser choice. There are decisions that get complicated by the sheer volume of angles the river insists on exploring, when sometimes what was needed was simpler. The cost of a river mind is real, but so is the cost of spending a life trying to dam it. That's the thing about these kinds of minds, and I suspect you know this if you have one. The suppression strategy never quite works. You can slow the river temporarily, you can build structures around it, but eventually it finds its level, and if you've spent your energy fighting it rather than working with it, the flooding is worse, and the landscape is less navigable than it would have been with a different approach. Working with a river mind means learning its rhythms, understanding which conditions make it run clean and fast versus murky and scattered, knowing when to follow it and when to step onto the bank and just watch for a while. Building a life, a creative practice, a work structure, a relationship with rest that accounts for the fact that the current is always there, even when you're not actively riding it. What a river mind produces, given the right conditions, is extraordinary. The lateral thinking that makes unexpected connections, the creative restlessness that keeps pushing past the first acceptable idea toward the one that's actually worth something, the genuine delight in complexity that makes certain kinds of problems feel like invitations rather than obstacles. These aren't incidental byproducts of the way a river mind works. They're the direct result of it. The thinking style and the output are the same thing. There's a particular kind of peace available to people who stop arguing with their own nature. Not the peace of stillness exactly, the river doesn't promise stillness, but the peace of moving with the current rather than against it, of building a life that works with what you actually are rather than the quieter, more manageable version of yourself you once tried to become. The river mind is not a disorder waiting to be treated. It's a way of being in the world that has produced some of the most interesting thinking, art, and discovery in human history by people who learned, eventually, to stop standing on the bank wishing the water would calm down, and started swimming.
When I close my eyes in meditation, I don't find emptiness. I find corridors. Long hallways with doors on either side, some open, some barely ajar, some sealed in ways that suggest they haven't been opened in years. The mind presents them without agenda. Here is this, and this, and this, and all I have to do is choose which one to walk toward. Or sometimes not even choose. Sometimes I'm already moving before the decision forms, drawn by something that registers as interest or resonance, or simply the pull of the unknown. This is what inner wandering actually feels like when you stop fighting it. It has architecture. It has depth. The corridors of thought don't lead nowhere. They lead somewhere specific, somewhere that has been waiting, somewhere that the ordinary busy mind never has time to reach. Behind one door, a future version of my life, still forming, not fully resolved, but present enough to be felt. I can walk around inside it for a while, notice which details are vivid and which are still blurry. The vividness tends to be what's genuine. The blurriness tells me where the vision still needs work, where I haven't yet decided what I actually want. Behind another, something unresolved, a conversation I've been circling around without quite entering, an emotion that's been waiting patiently in the corridor for acknowledgement. In Meditattra, I can open that door with a different quality of attention than I bring to ordinary waking hours, quieter, less defended, without the reflex to manage or immediately resolve. And what's behind it is rarely as difficult as the closed door made it seem. There are doors I find myself returning to across different sessions. The same corridor appearing again, the same half-open threshold, something still not fully explored. I've started treating those as signals. The recurring rooms are the ones with something worth spending more time in. The subconscious is patient. It will keep presenting the same door until you walk through it fully. What you find when you follow the thoughts rather than suppress them is, above all, that the thoughts have direction. They aren't random. Even the ones that seem to careen sideways into something unrelated tend, if you follow them far enough, to circle back to something central, something you care about, something you're afraid of, something you want. The river mind has its own navigation. It just uses a different map than the one the analytical mind prefers. There's a quality of discovery in Meditattra that no external experience quite replicates. The best conversations approach it. The best books approach it. But neither of them gives you full access to your own interior in the way that simply going in and looking around does. You are the only one who can walk those particular corridors, and many of them have been there for years, quietly holding what you put in them, waiting for the day you had enough stillness to return. The invitation is simple, even if the practice takes some getting used to. Close the eyes. Release the direction. Let the first corridor present itself, and instead of dismissing what appears or hurrying past in search of something more obviously useful, stay with it. Follow the door that draws you. See what's been kept there. Most of the time, what I find in those rooms isn't what I expected. It's something better, something more honest. A version of clarity that could only be reached by wandering rather than by going directly, because the most important things have a way of living just off the main path, in the rooms you wouldn't have entered if you were trying to get somewhere specific. What door have you been walking past for a while now, telling yourself you'll open it later? And what do you think might be waiting on the other side?
There's a version of self-improvement that has always made me uneasy. The one that begins with the premise that you are the problem, that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is best closed by correcting yourself, smoothing the edges, suppressing the tendencies, training yourself into the shape the practice requires. Follow the system, match the format, become the kind of person for whom this works. And I understand the appeal of that. Systems exist for a reason. The accumulated wisdom in a meditation tradition or a training methodology or a creative practice isn't arbitrary. It reflects what has worked across many people over significant time. That's worth respecting. But respecting something isn't the same as assuming it applies to you without modification. The Meditattra realization was about meditation, but the principle underneath it is much wider. It shows up everywhere. Exercise, for instance. The fitness world has its dominant formats, the training programs, the schedules, the correct ratio of intensity to recovery. And for some people, these formats are revelatory, finally giving structure to what was previously shapeless effort. For others, they're a series of boxes that generate guilt every time they aren't checked. The question worth asking is not why you can't seem to follow the program, it's whether the program was ever actually designed for someone built the way you are. Movement that happens consistently in a form that fits you will always outperform the perfect program you abandon in week 3. Creativity operates the same way. There's an entire industry of creative practice advice, morning pages, the 2-hour deep work block, the specific notebook and pen combination, the romanticized workspace. Some people thrive inside these structures. Others find that the structure itself becomes the obstacle, that the ritual of preparation consumes the energy the creation was supposed to use. The writer who produces their best work in 15-minute fragments between other things isn't doing it wrong, they're doing it in the shape that fits them. Productivity is perhaps the most colonized territory of all. The frameworks multiply endlessly, each one promising to finally solve the problem of the gap between what you intend and what you do. And they carry an implicit message. The reason you aren't productive enough is a method problem, and the method problem can be fixed by adopting the right system. Sometimes that's true, but often the real issue is that the system was built for a different kind of mind, a different relationship to time, a different set of competing demands. The most functional productivity practice I've ever developed is the one I built from scratch by observing how I actually work, when my energy peaks, how I transition between tasks, what kinds of interruption I can absorb, and which ones collapse the session entirely. No framework told me those things. I had to look.
Relationships carry the same invitation, though it's harder to name there. The templates for how relationships are supposed to unfold, the milestones, the expressions of care, the definitions of closeness, these too can become containers that don't fit what's actually present between two people. The relationship that works is the one both people build honestly, from what they actually are and what they actually need, rather than from the script they were handed and felt obligated to follow. The common thread in all of this is not rebellion for its own sake. It's not the rejection of wisdom or the dismissal of what others have built. It's something more specific and more useful than that. The willingness to treat yourself as the primary source of information about what works for you. To take the existing frameworks as starting points rather than verdicts. To iterate, to observe, to keep adjusting until something fits. The practice that sticks is the one you built to fit the life you're actually living, not the ideal life the practice was designed for. And there's more wisdom in that kind of honest adaptation than years of trying to force yourself into a shape that was never quite yours.
There's a layer of the mind that doesn't get much airtime during the ordinary day. It isn't the thinking mind, the one managing the schedule, composing the reply, solving the immediate problem. It's the one underneath, the one that has been quietly working on everything the surface mind was too busy to finish, processing the conversation from 3 days ago, assembling connections between ideas that seemed unrelated, holding the emotional material that got set aside because the day required function. Most of the time, we don't hear from it directly. It communicates in the margins, the insight that arrives in the shower, the solution that surfaces mid-walk, the mood that was inexplicably different by evening without any apparent cause. Brief transmissions from somewhere below, and then the noise of living closes back over them. Meditattra, for me, is what happens when I create a longer opening, when I stop moving and go inward and simply wait, without an agenda, without a question I'm trying to answer, without the usual pressure to arrive somewhere useful. And in that space, the deeper processing layer begins to surface. What comes up isn't always what I expected. Sometimes it's a feeling I hadn't consciously registered, a quiet unease about something I'd been handling on autopilot, or a satisfaction about something I hadn't stopped to acknowledge. Emotional material that had been running in the background, waiting for a moment of stillness to be felt properly. Other times, it's more like reception. Something arrives that feels less like retrieval and more like discovery. A connection between two things I hadn't linked before. A direction that was previously unclear suddenly presenting itself with a quality of obviousness that makes me wonder why it took so long. The subconscious, it turns out, had already done the work. I just needed to stop generating enough noise to hear the result. There's a well-documented phenomenon in cognitive science, sometimes called the default mode network, the brain's activity when it isn't focused on a specific external task. What researchers found, counterintuitively, is that this network is extraordinarily active during rest and mind-wandering. The brain doesn't go quiet when you stop directing it. It shifts into a different and equally sophisticated mode of operation, one associated with self-reflection, future simulation, the integration of memory, and creative insight. The wandering mind isn't an idle mind. It's a mind doing something the focused mind cannot. This is what Meditattra taps into. The unstructured wandering isn't a failure to concentrate, it's an invitation to the processing layer that concentration tends to suppress. When I follow a thought down a corridor without knowing where it leads, I'm not wasting the session. I'm giving the default mode network exactly the conditions it needs to do its most sophisticated work. What I've noticed, practically, is that the sessions with the most apparent aimlessness are often the ones that produce the most useful material afterward. The evening where I lay down and let the mind drift through whatever it wanted and woke the next morning with something resolved that I hadn't consciously been working on. The session where I followed a thread that seemed irrelevant and found, at its end, something that had been waiting a long time to be found. The subconscious doesn't need to be interrogated to yield what it holds.
It needs conditions, quiet, undemanding, receptive conditions, and then it offers things on its own schedule, in its own language, in the form of images and feelings and sudden knowings that land with a weight that analytical thinking rarely produces. We spend so much of our lives generating, producing output, making decisions, solving what's in front of us. Meditattra is the practice of receiving instead, of making enough silence that the deeper layer can speak, and trusting that what it says, however quietly, is worth hearing. What has your subconscious been trying to tell you that the noise of your days keeps interrupting?
We've inherited a particular image of inner stillness. The figure seated in perfect posture. The breath slow when counted. The mind emptied of everything that isn't the present moment, held in a clear and luminous quiet. It's a beautiful image, and for some people, it's also completely true, a real description of a real state they can enter and sustain. But there's an assumption embedded in that image that I think is worth examining. That stillness and silence are the same thing. That the quiet mind is necessarily the empty mind. That if thoughts are present, stillness has failed. My experience is that this simply isn't the only way stillness works. There's a quality of inner quiet that has nothing to do with the absence of thought. It has to do with the relationship to thought. Whether the mind is being driven by what it's thinking, or whether it's moving through thought the way a river moves through landscape, shaped by it, responsive to it, but not controlled by it. That second quality, the fluency, the ease of motion, the sense of being inside the current rather than battered by it, that is a form of stillness. Different in texture from the empty mind, but genuinely quiet in its own register. Different minds seem to arrive at stillness through different architectures. The empty mind works for some. The focused breath, the returning attention, the gradual release of content until something genuinely spacious opens. That's real, and the people for whom it works often describe it as the deepest rest they know. For others, stillness arrives through absorption. The complete engagement with something demanding enough that the self-referential noise quiets on its own, not because it was suppressed, but because all available attention was summoned somewhere else. The musician mid-improvisation, the programmer deep in an elegant problem, the athlete in flow, where the body knows what to do before the mind has finished deciding. These states are not meditative in the traditional sense. And yet, the people who inhabit them regularly describe a quality of peace inside them that rivals anything produced by formal practice. There's a third architecture that I know most personally, the one Meditattra lives in. Stillness through free movement. The mind allowed to go wherever it wants, at whatever pace it chooses, without resistance or redirection. And paradoxically, in that freedom, something settles. The frantic quality that thought has when it's being fought dissolves when the fighting stops. The river that was turbulent because of the dam upstream runs clean when the obstruction is removed. Each architecture produces something slightly different. The empty mind tends toward clarity, a scrubbed clean quality of perception, the world seen without the usual layer of interpretation. The absorbed mind tends toward integration, the self and the activity becoming temporarily one thing, the usual distance between observer and observed briefly dissolved. The free-moving mind tends toward revelation, the subconscious surfacing, the connections forming, the things that were waiting to be found finally finding their way to the surface. None of these is superior to the others. They're different instruments producing different music. And the question worth sitting with isn't which architecture is most legitimate, it's which one you can actually inhabit.
Which one, when you enter it, produces something that feels like genuine rest rather than the performance of rest? Stillness, at its most honest, is not a posture or a protocol. It's what happens when the resistance stops, whatever form that resistance takes, and whatever form its stopping takes for you specifically. The empty mind and the wandering mind and the absorbed mind are all doing the same essential thing, finding the place where the fighting ends, and resting there in their own particular way for as long as they can.
Presence, in the popular sense, has become something you're supposed to achieve, a destination, something you arrive at through sufficient technique, the right breathing pattern, the correct posture, the disciplined return of attention every time it wanders, the accumulation of enough practice hours that the scattered mind finally settles into the moment it's been avoiding. And I tried that version, genuinely, repeatedly, over years. What I kept finding was something that felt more like effort than arrival, a presence performed rather than inhabited, the sensation of watching myself be present rather than simply being present, which is of course exactly the opposite of what presence is supposed to feel like. The forced version has its own texture. You could feel it. The slight strain of keeping attention exactly where it's supposed to be, the awareness of the awareness, the monitoring of the monitoring, the part of the mind that keeps checking whether the other part of the mind is doing it correctly. It produces something, a kind of grounded alertness that has value, but it rarely produces the thing I'd felt presence could be in the moments I'd encountered it accidentally without trying. Because natural presence doesn't feel like effort at all. It feels like something releasing rather than something engaging. The attention isn't held in place. It arrives and stays because what it's resting on is genuinely interesting. The moment isn't being maintained. It's simply what's happening, and what's happening is enough. Meditattra gave me access to that quality in a way that forced practice never did. Not because it's more disciplined. It's less disciplined in all the formal senses, but because it removes the mechanism of force entirely. When I lie down and release the thoughts to go wherever they want, the relationship between my attention and its object becomes voluntary. The thoughts I follow are the ones that draw me. The corridors I enter are the ones I'm genuinely curious about. And in that genuine curiosity, in the act of following what actually interests me rather than fixing my attention on what I've been told should interest me, presence arrives on its own. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Forced presence is presence in the shape of a container you've been handed. Natural presence is presence in the shape of who you actually are. One requires maintenance, the other just requires the conditions to be right, and the willingness to stop overriding those conditions with what you think the practice is supposed to look like. There's something deeper underneath this, worth naming directly. Forced presence at some level carries a judgment about the mind as it is. The wandering is treated as the problem. The distraction is treated as failure. The natural movement of thought is the enemy to be overcome. And you can spend a great deal of energy overcoming it with real results. But the energy cost is significant, and the underlying message that you are not already in the right shape for this is always quietly there. Natural presence works the other way. It starts from the premise that the mind as it moves is already engaged in something real, that the wandering has direction, that the thoughts have intelligence, that following them faithfully is its own form of being here. And from that premise, the self stops being the obstacle to its own stillness. The judgment lifts, and in the space the judgment was occupying, something quieter and more genuine settles in. Presence doesn't require force. It requires honesty about what kind of mind you have, what kind of attention feels natural, what kind of practice actually fits the person doing the practicing. When those things align, you don't have to work your way into the moment. You find you were already here. What would your practice look like if presence were something you arrived at by becoming more yourself rather than less?
Everything we've explored in this series traces back to a single act, looking honestly at the kind of mind you actually have, not the mind you think you should have, not the mind the practice was designed for, not the mind that would make self-improvement simpler or more straightforward or more flattering to describe. The one that's actually there, with its specific tendencies and resistances, its own way of moving through thought, its own relationship to stillness, its own version of what clarity feels like from the inside. This sounds like the beginning of an inquiry. In practice, for most people, it's the part that gets skipped. We tend to encounter a practice first and ask whether we can fit ourselves into it, not whether it fits us. The framework arrives with authority, often backed by tradition or science or the visible evidence of other people it has worked for, and so we treat the mismatch between us and it as a personal problem rather than an informational one. We try harder. We extend the trial period. We attribute the friction to insufficient discipline rather than insufficient fit. The Meditattra realization was, at its core, a refusal to keep doing that, a decision to treat the persistent mismatch as data, as the mind communicating something true about itself, rather than as a deficit to be corrected. And what followed from that refusal was more useful than years of trying to force the original fit. Self-knowledge in this context is practical rather than philosophical. It's less about grand questions of identity and more about granular observation. How does your energy actually move across a day? What conditions make you generative and what conditions flatten you? Does your thinking clarify in silence or in motion? Do you arrive at insight through focused pursuit or through the oblique approach, the answer coming from the side when you stopped looking directly at it? What have you been calling laziness or resistance that might actually be your intelligence refusing something that doesn't fit? These aren't questions with universal answers. They're questions that only you can answer through the specific and patient observation of how you actually function, not theoretically, not aspirationally, but in the ordinary evidence of your own days. And when you have those answers, something changes about the way you build a practice. You stop shopping for the system that will finally fix the gap between your intentions and your behavior. You start building from what you know, smaller, more honest, more granular, but durable in a way that borrowed architectures rarely are, because it was built from the inside out rather than the outside in. The practice that fits doesn't feel like discipline from the outside. It feels like returning to something native, like the difference between wearing a suit that was made for someone else and wearing something that was cut to the specific measurements of your actual body. Both might look similar from a distance, only one disappears when you put it on. There's a generosity in this approach that's easy to miss. When you stop asking yourself to be a different kind of mind, you make room for the one you have to operate at its actual capacity. The river stops fighting the banks it was given. The wandering mind stops apologizing for wandering. The person who finds clarity in motion or in free-flowing thought or in absorption rather than emptiness, that person stops being a failed version of something else and becomes the full version of what they actually are. Meditattra was never really about meditation, it was about permission. The permission to look honestly at what works for this particular mind in this particular life and build from there, without the constant overhead of trying to be otherwise. That permission, once given, extends everywhere, and the practice that follows, whatever shape it takes, tends to finally, reliably, stick.
There's a particular quality that certain Meditattra sessions take on, a shift in atmosphere that I've come to recognize and quietly look forward to. It happens when the wandering mind, having moved through the corridors and followed its threads without agenda, begins to settle somewhere. Not because I directed it there, but because something in the deeper processing found its own orientation, its own center of gravity, and the thoughts begin to organize themselves around a direction rather than simply flowing through it. This is when the visions come. Not visions in any mystical sense, though the experience does carry a quality of revelation that rational language undersells.
What I mean is that the mind, given enough freedom, eventually starts to assemble something. Images of a life not yet lived but recognizable as mine. A version of the future that feels less like fantasy and more like a place I've already been somehow. A direction that arrives not with the brash confidence of ambition, but with the quiet certainty of something remembered. The wandering that preceded it wasn't wasted. That's what I've come to understand. The drift through the corridors, the following of tangents, the free movement through whatever the mind wanted to explore, all of it was preparing the conditions for this. The subconscious was running its processes, making connections, sorting through what matters and what doesn't, slowly assembling what the conscious mind was too busy to build during the ordinary hours. And then it presents the result. In images, in feeling, in the particular warmth that future visions carry when they're genuinely yours rather than borrowed from what you think you should want. Once the vision is present, once it's been held in Meditattra long enough to feel real, it starts to function differently in ordinary life. It becomes a reference point, a direction the body already knows, even when the explicit details are still unclear. The daily choices begin to orient toward it or away from it in ways that are easier to feel than to explain. The wandering mind wasn't aimless after all. It was always going somewhere, tracing its way through the corridors toward the rooms that mattered, making the connections that would eventually resolve into a picture, building in the dark what the conscious mind couldn't assemble in the light. When you give it enough space, it will show you where it wants to go. And the vision it produces, assembled in stillness, offered freely, carrying the particular warmth of something genuinely yours, worth more than any plan you could have made by force. What vision has been assembling itself in the quiet spaces of your life, just waiting for you to be still enough to receive it?